Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last night of this year's London History Festival. Yes, you have to wait till next November for another one. We're very pleased to have, we've had Philip before, he gave us an excellent talk on Aleppo a few years ago, so I'm very pleased to welcome him back to talk about Louis XIV. Philip Mansel.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here again. And you might think Aleppo and Louis XIV are different subjects, but in fact they're all connected, because Louis XIV was King of France and Navarre, his hereditary titles, but he also had global ambitions. He wanted to grab half the Ottoman Empire if it collapsed, and he always thought in global and European terms. In fact, he can be judged by the many different regions and countries to which he travelled or which he wanted to conquer, as much as by the time in which he lived. By 1682, for example, he had travelled the breadth and length of France. From Dunkirk in the north, he's shown here about to enter Dunkirk, 1662, he's just bought it from Charles II, and in fact, he went to Dunkirk 5 times in his reign. Well, if any of you have travelled from Paris to Dunkirk now, it is a very long and difficult journey. Imagine what it was like in 1662. But this was a very energetic, hard-working monarch who liked to see his properties, his slightly like a landed aristocrat, inspecting and expanding his hereditary estate. In addition, until 1693, he went campaigning every summer, when there was a war on, to the battlefields of what de Gaulle would call the Avenue of Death in Flanders, the cockpit of Europe. And he was interested in travel itself in the world. He would frequently receive, during his public meals in Versailles, French travellers and missionaries, discussing their journeys with them during dinner, giving them permission to dedicate travel books to him. Here he is outside Strasbourg, which he takes in 1681. It's this king who made Alsace French. For once, he ruled with a light hand, allowing them to go on speaking German and to worship, to be Lutherans and Calvinists. And here is an example of a map of his global ambitions. You see he takes the whole valley of the Mississippi, 1681 to 85, attempts to have colonies more or less all over the world. Pondicherry becomes French in his reign, Mauritius and the Ile de la Réunion, trading companies, and this map doesn't show he's in contact with Siam and China from the 1680s. His Majesty loves sciences extremely, and every kind of knowledge which can acquire in foreign countries. And conversation at Versailles was just as likely to be about Aleppo, Siam, or America as about France or Europe. 1685, for example, the king bade farewell to the first French ambassador to Siam, placed his hands on the shoulders of Father Vacher and said, "So you want to leave? I pray to our Lord to give a happy success to all our plans. I know they are good, and I hope we will soon meet again." "Sir, I indeed expect it," came the reply, "but if it please God, we will meet again in paradise and not in your kingdom." And travellers would encourage Louis XIV's dreams of a global empire. Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, for example, who travelled from court to court across Asia in search of jewels, dedicated an account to Louis XIV. All those marvels of the empire of the Turk, the Persian and the Mogul have been effaced from my mind at the sight of the grandeurs of your court. It seems to me that all the kings of Asia and Africa will one day be your tributaries, and that you are destined to command the entire universe. Well, as you know, Louis XIV loved hearing that sort of thing, and it came throughout his reign. And in fact, there's a globe you can see in the Bibliothèque Nationale, Site François Mitterrand, which is a huge globe by Coronelli, dedicated to the august majesty of Louis the Great, the invincible, the fortunate, the astonishment of so many nations, all of which he could have conquered, goes the dedication, if his moderation had not equaled his glory. And he was obsessed with many European countries. He wanted to keep Poland as a stable hereditary monarchy, preferably ruled by a French prince or a prince with a French wife. He was well aware of the danger of it being gobbled up by Russia, Austria and Brandenburg, even in the 1660s. But the problem was you couldn't get French troops to Danzig, or it was very, very difficult. A problem that goes on till 1939. He's very concerned with expanding in the Rhineland. This is one of the motifs of his reign, and he does in fact secure Alsace, as I've said, Flanders and Franche-Comté. He considers grabbing the Ottoman Empire, he considers conquering Siam, and he enters into relations with China. But I want to talk especially tonight on a subject that I know is close to many of your hearts, which is his French relations with England. Always electrifying, never dull. So we go on for a bit. This is his ambassador outside Athens, a wonderful picture now in the Museum of the City of Athens on loan from France, which shows the Acropolis before it's been bombarded by the Venetians, Athens as an Ottoman city, and that is the French ambassador with his escort, partly French, partly Ottoman. 1674, he's going round the whole Eastern Mediterranean, enforcing French permits to trade and indeed for missionaries to go and try and convert Christians and Jews to Catholicism. Here is an incredible picture just discovered in Paris of Jerusalem, again with the French ambassador on his mission in 1674 by somebody called Jacques Carré. It was commissioned by the ambassador, painted in Istanbul from sketches done in Jerusalem, and then hidden in the ambassador's chateau for centuries in France, and only just recently discovered in a flat in Paris. You can see it now if you go to Oscar de la Renta's headquarters on the Rue de Marignan. It's on a wall on the first floor. And I think it's the first accurate view of Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And in fact, it confirms how France had good relations with the Ottoman Empire, because it confirms their permission to trade and preach. In fact, this is a key to Louis XIV's foreign policy, to keep the Ottoman Empire going. Here you see a view of Aleppo, 1685, done by a Frenchman, 1675, done by a Frenchman called Grelot. Again, the first accurate panorama of Aleppo. Here is one of those travellers, Cavanier, in a sort of form of Persian dress. And some of these travel books that were dedicated to the king. You see, Présenté au roi. A voyage of the Levant by order of the king. And this is a botanist going to get bulbs in Anatolia. A voyage to Siam of missionaries sent by the king to the Indies and to China. The first accurate travel books about Siam, published in Paris in the 1680s, still authorities for how that kingdom was ruled in those days. And here you see one of the high points of his reign. 1686, the Siamese Embassy comes to the Galerie des Glaces. The king is on a silver throne, subsequently melted down to pay for his wars. They are bowing, courtiers, families surrounding. It all looks very grand and dignified. In reality, we have a diary by a courtier saying the crowds were so great it took the ambassadors half an hour to push through from one end of the gallery to the king at the other. And in the end, the king had to get down from his throne and make a way for them with his stick, as he often did. The French court was quite disorderly. It wasn't as formal as other courts. There you see them again with presents. Then the king sent presents back with a return ship, 1687 to 8. But he goes too far, as he often did, and he sends troops and he tries to take over Siam, and there is a huge reaction. He also tries to convert the king of Siam, saying Catholicism is the only true religion, and this is the sort of culminating factor, it is the religion which preaches most complete obedience to monarchs, i.e. that is what really mattered to him. But the king of Siam answered, if God had only wanted there to be one religion in the world, he wouldn't have created creatures and animals and plants in so many different forms. Clearly, the deity loves diversity. Now, back to England. Here is Blenheim Palace, as I'm sure you all know, built with the profits of war against France, a symbol of England's victory over France. Louis XIV himself, in his memoirs, calls the English les anciens et irréconciliables ennemis de la France, the ancient and irreconcilable enemies of France, naturally ill-disposed towards the French. That is the standard picture, as this palace confirms. And there were world wars between France and England, 1689 to 97, in America, India, Africa, as well as Europe, and again 1702 to 1713, the War of the Spanish Succession. Just to confirm his victory, the Duke of Marlborough took this bust of Louis XIV from the gates of Tournai, and it now crowns the south facade of Blenheim Palace. However, at the same time, the two countries were linked together. Each one was, I would say, the natural model for, refuge from, and alternative to the other. And there is another peaceful relationship between France and England, which is often forgotten. Here you have a picture, 1669, by Nocret, of the French royal family as gods of Olympus. Louis XIV is naturally Apollo, I think, or maybe Jupiter, cousins, his wife, his mother. But here is the Duchesse d'Orléans, the sister of Charles II of England, married to Louis XIV's gay brother, Monsieur. And there is Henrietta Maria in the corner, for there had been this great French-British royal marriage, 1625. Henrietta Maria marries Charles I, and after that, really, the shuttle between London and Paris starts again, and it's really practically never stopped except during wartime since. Endless influences, naturally influences between London and Paris, the two grandest cities in Western Europe, naturally needing each other. They were capitals of kingdoms with powerful nobilities and dynamic merchant cities. Charles II and James II were Louis XIV's first cousins, whom he knew as a boy in the 1640s and 50s when they were exiles from the English Civil War. And Madame is a natural link between the two countries, as indeed is Henrietta Maria, who lived some of the time in London and some of the time outside Paris. When she goes to Paris in 1665, she's accompanied by Christopher Wren, who admires the Louvre and all the monuments that Louis XIV is building. And of course, the Chelsea Royal Hospital is partly London's answer to the much grander and more glamorous Hôtel des Invalides. They're always thinking of each other. James II declares himself a Catholic in 1669, a year after his father figure, the Maréchal de Turenne, has also converted from Protestantism to Catholicism. Here is Madame Duchesse d'Orléans, a great friend of Louis XIV. She helps him negotiate the secret Treaty of Dover, 1670, when Charles II becomes Louis XIV's ally, and he promises that if he gets more money, he will declare himself Catholic and give new rights to Catholics in England. I think it was probably a vain promise. It was just a device to get more money. And Louis XIV is determined to have a war on the Netherlands, the richest country in Europe, which had annoyed him. And when he's trying to persuade the English ambassador, Henry Savile, he declared, according to Savile, more passionate expressions of friendship than I ever heard from any man in my whole life. I do hardly see how he can say more to his mistress. And the war starts, 1672, and guess who is an Englishman serving in the Royal Anglais regiment in the French army? It is John Churchill, future Duke of Marlborough, who is called, he's so good looking, he's called the handsome Englishman. And that is another Englishman going to and fro between London and Paris, German Chamberlain of Henrietta Maria, who creates Jermyn Street and St James's Square. And here is another link between the two. Charles II has fallen in love with the lady-in-waiting of his sister Louise de Keroualle. She's swept to England. In time, her apartment in Whitehall Palace, much grander and larger than Queen Catherine of Braganza's, is the true centre of government in England. That is where ministers meet. She becomes Duchess of Portsmouth in England, and Duchesse d'Aubigny, rewarded by a grateful Louis XIV for all she's done for Anglo-French relations. And outside her apartment, I'm ashamed to say, a London wit put up a placard saying, "Within this room a bed's appointed for a French bitch and the Lord's anointed." And she gets £40,000 a year from Charles II, more from Louis XIV. And in fact, her apartment is a corner of France in the middle of London. There she is again. Her descendants, the Dukes of Richmond, have some of her treasures at Goodwood, which in fact again is like a bit of France in the middle of England, with Gobelins tapestries and French furniture and portraits. That's a portrait at Goodwood of Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's girlfriend, who encouraged again his war on the Netherlands in the 1670s. I feel they exchanged portraits, Portsmouth and Montespan, as colleagues in the same line of business. That is Charles II's favourite illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, who again is fighting with the French army in the 1670s. And 1685, the catastrophe of Louis XIV's reign, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, when the Protestants who'd been living peaceably and profitably in France are deprived of all their rights. He doesn't want them to leave, but in fact the market is stronger than the monarchy, and somehow they can get their way out in conditions which you cannot read about without thinking of refugees in the 20th century. They're tracked across the Alps. People are paid to denounce them. People are paid to steal their possessions, their properties. People buy their properties at low prices in Montpellier and Bordeaux and so on. Nevertheless, they cross the Channel. Some go to the Netherlands, many to Berlin, strengthening France's enemies, transferring France's technological lead to its enemies, and others come to England. Here is some Huguenot gold and silver which they made. They were the best craftsmen of their day. A teapot by de Lamery and a wine urn now at Boughton House in Northamptonshire. And they also transfer knowledge. Pistols. London becomes the gun capital of Europe. And although they're anti-Louis XIV, nevertheless they in a way increase French cultural influence in England, because they bring all this knowledge. They write the first good dictionaries are by somebody called Abel Boyer, Dictionnaire Royal Français Anglais. They reinforce these links, and many of them in fact go on trading with the enemy, and because of their commercial links in France they increase Anglo-French trade. Abel Boyer, who's the first person to print regular reports of parliamentary debates, he called himself Gallo-Britannicus. And they spread French culture and the French language almost more effectively than all Louis XIV's propaganda, his buildings at Versailles, the prints he commissioned, and so on. And here is a leading Huguenot general, Henri de Rouvigny, later Earl of Galway. He hated leaving France, but once he's in England, he becomes a general in the British Army, and curiously enough, he reinforces in Ireland anti-Catholic legislation in revenge for what has happened to the Protestants in England. Again, this constant tit for tat. And as I said, some Huguenots went on trading with France, and here is an ivory of Louis XIV in his glory, with bound slaves around the pedestal of his statue, and that is by a Huguenot working in the 1690s in England. 1688, another catastrophic blunder by Louis XIV, again a sign that Europe is a complete political system. He is sending his troops into Germany to stop Austrian forces advancing on Istanbul, because he wants to keep the Ottoman Empire going as the best ally of France and the best check on the power of the House of Austria. Thereby he lets William III, also a cousin, his first cousin once removed, as William had long planned, invade England with a vast fleet and army, a European force which he'd been raising both as Prince of Orange and as Captain General of the Netherlands, German, Swedish, Danish troops, as well as Dutch and some English and Scottish. And they sail peacefully, unopposed, down the Channel in November 1688, as the hunting season is beginning at Fontainebleau for Louis XIV. They land in Devon. And then, as Louis XIV's armies are devastating the Rhineland with appalling loss of life and destruction of Heidelberg, Mannheim, Mainz, and many other cities, William advances peacefully, practically without a shot being fired in anger, on London. His best ally in England is John Churchill, future Duke of Marlborough, commander of James II's forces, who at exactly the right moment goes over and joins William. Everything worked like clockwork, because everything had been prepared long in advance. And he didn't come to England, as William constantly proclaimed, for Parliament or Protestantism. He comes for Europe. He comes for his grand strategy, which is to limit the power of Louis XIV by using the resources of the British monarchy, already very rich with a good army and navy. And that is exactly what he does. The English, not always willingly, the army and navy are used against France from January 1689, practically before William is proclaimed king. There you see the fleet again, the best amphibious operation until D-Day. And there you see another of these Anglo-French figures who are nipping across the Channel the whole time, not just merchants and artists and craftsmen, but somebody called the Duc de Lauzun, a favourite of Louis XIV, who comes over in November 1688 on a secret mission, and it's he who takes James II's wife, Mary of Modena, by boat from near London to the coast near Calais, and then she becomes Louis XIV's guest. Neither James II nor his wife dared trust any English people. And there you see James II arriving at Saint-Germain, being greeted by his cousin, whom he hadn't seen since they danced in court ballets together as boys in the early 1650s. And there is Mary of Modena waiting in her bed, the whole French court looking on in admiration. They think Louis XIV is acting as a god, consoling an unfortunate monarch. But later, the courtiers, when they got to talk to Louis XIV, there's some wonderful to James II, there's some wonderful letters about him. They call him a fool who lost 3 kingdoms for a mass. When you listen to him, you know why he's here. Nevertheless, the Jacobite court becomes a fixture. There are over 500 meetings between the French and English royal families until Louis's death in 1715. Again, a misjudgment. He's committing French policy to somebody who's a born loser. And Mary of Modena said, who was more tactful than her husband, that Louis XIV was not only the greatest king, but the greatest gentleman in the world. And in fact, the Jacobites, to a certain extent, replaced the Huguenots who fled France. About 30,000, mainly Catholic Jacobites, come to France, Irish, Scottish and English, and they become very good soldiers, and several are marshals of France. And curiously enough, de Gaulle had Jacobite blood, so that may explain his stubborn streak. Well taught in the art of saying no. There is William III, a great general, a great European, a great diplomat, and extremely brave, whereas Louis XIV liked to watch battles mainly from a really rather safe distance. William III plunges in. And if he'd had a son, if he'd been in a stronger dynastic position, I'm sure England would have had a much more powerful monarchy. There's Louis XIV by Charles Le Brun, addressed as a Roman general outside the city of Douai, one of the many cities of the southern Netherlands that he's slowly picking off in the 1670s and 80s. That is Saint-Germain, where the Jacobite court stayed, about 1,000 people, lots of impoverished soldiers swarming around the town. Some Jacobites stayed there till the French Revolution. And there is James II by Mignard in exile, in the robes of the Order of the Garter. There are 2 orders of the Garter, one being awarded in England and another being awarded by the Jacobites in exile, with Mary of Modena, the future old pretender, and a child born in 1692 called La Consolatrice. And again, Jacobites have a certain cultural influence in France, bringing it curiously closer to England. Novels, memoirs, military books by somebody called the Chevalier de Ramsay, and the first Freemasons in Paris are Jacobites. That is the Duke of Perth, James II's minister in exile. And here are some of the portraits of Jacobite people painted by French artists, by La Gillière, and you see how French they immediately look. This is Lady Mary Herbert, and this is Sir Marmaduke, the name, Throckmorton from Cowton Court. And this is William III's ambassador to Louis XIV, 1697, his favourite, Hans Willem Bentinck, Earl of Portland. There's a brilliant chapter in Nancy Mitford's The Sun King called Lord Portland's Embassy, on which nobody could improve, but she completely leaves out Louis XIV's simultaneous friendship with James II. So there's some accounts by Portland and his diplomats of seeing the Jacobites at the same court ceremonies. You can imagine the looks they gave each other. And Portland, the war between William and Louis XIV is not only religious and strategic, it's also botanical. They're rival growers of tulips and flowers, and Portland assures William III that Louis's flowers are nowhere near as fine as your Majesty's. Even he admitted that nothing could beat the garden at Marly, which was Louis XIV's pavilion and escape from Versailles, and it's now all gone, all destroyed during and after the French Revolution, more by property dealers and demolishers than by revolutionaries. Matthew Prior talks about civility mixed with contempt. They looked at each other across galleries. There could not be two kings of England, but Louis XIV insisted on giving not only hospitality to James II, but recognizing his son as James III when he died in 1701. Some kissed his shoes, there were tears of joy, acclamations, and then bits of James II's body were distributed around churches in Paris like the relics of a martyr, which is what he really was considered, a Catholic martyr. And it was another blunder by Louis XIV, because nothing could guarantee England not accepting a Jacobite that better than French support for a Jacobite. And Louis just didn't understand this, and many people told him he's really playing to his French audience and perhaps pleasing Madame de Maintenon and Mary of Modena. And this is another great scene. 1700, Louis accepts the throne of Spain on behalf of his grandson, Philip V, again showing the importance of Europe. He's putting the prospect of the Spanish monarchy passing to the Bourbons ahead of the possibility of even more territorial expansion for his own kingdom of France. His ministers wanted expansion, but the king puts his family, that's Philip V, before any other consideration. And I think any other monarch of the time would have done the same. And since there is now a Bourbon reigning in Spain, but not in France, maybe Louis XIV knew what he was doing. Anyway, 1702, the War of the Spanish Succession breaks out. It's also about domination of Italy, domination of the Rhineland, as well as who's going to be King of Spain, a Bourbon or the Habsburg claimant who is backed by the Netherlands and England. And lurking under all these factors is, of course, the slave trade. France wanted the monopoly of supplying slaves to the Spanish colonies in America. The Bourbons would give it to him. England wanted that monopoly for itself. And monarchs who considered themselves the height of piety, like Louis XIV and Queen Anne, they were also personally dealing in the slave trade. Anyway, War of the Spanish Succession. As I am sure you know, Marlborough sweeps to victory, victory after victory. Queen Anne lived in Kensington Palace, just round the corner. Really a very modest life, but it's she who goes off for tedium after tedium at St. Paul's. Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet. They're not only Allied victories, they are really French routs where the army breaks. French soldiers just aren't as strong or as well paid, and French artillery is not as well made as Allied equivalents. And the Duke of Marlborough is not only a great general, he's also a brilliant European diplomat, at ease in The Hague and Brussels, Vienna and Berlin, bothering to have good personal relations with Allied princes and generals, particularly with Prince Eugene of Savoy, the great Austrian general, who, by the way, is a personal enemy of Louis XIV. He had been a cousin, but Louis XIV refuses him a regiment because he's gay, he has a terrible reputation, and his mother has been, a former girlfriend of Louis XIV, had been involved in the Affaire des Poisons, and she'd fled France, a sure sign of guilt. So Prince Eugene has a lot to avenge, and goodness me, he succeeds. And he is much more anti-French even than Marlborough. Here is Marlborough, a Brussels tapestry, a sort of equivalent of Gobelins. Here he is again, another grand equestrian portrait of a leader. He's extremely ambitious. He wanted to be Captain General of all English forces for life, which nobody had been before. Goodness knows where his ambitions would have led him. And there is Marlborough's nephew. He's not well known in England. He's the Marshal Duke of Berwick. He is the illegitimate son of James II by his affair with Arabella Churchill, sister of John Churchill. He rises in the ranks of the French army, and here he is defending Toulon from attack by Allied forces. And he achieves another first. I think he's made a duke in his own right in 3 countries. He's Duke of Berwick in England, Duke of Fitzjames in France, and Duke of Lyria in Spain. 1709, France is on its knees. Marlborough thinks he's going to install as the States General in Paris. He really believes in the possibility of regime change. But France, as usual, is tougher than it seems. The fortresses that Louis XIV had built resisted Marlborough's army more successfully than he anticipated. Even though there was famine, terrible harvests, riots in Paris, where there is a placard saying of the French royal family, the grandfather is a boaster, the son is an imbecile, the grandson is a great coward. Frenchmen, I pity you. Why don't you do as in England? I leave it to you. And so again showing that England is a natural alternative. And however, Louis XIV is saved by his own forts, one good general, the Maréchal de Villars. Spanish resistance, in fact the Castilians far preferred Philip V, the legitimate heir to the throne, than the Allied candidates. The English Parliament said no peace without Spain, but it was completely unrealistic. And also, there is a change of government in England. Louis XIV wrote one evening while working late at night, there cannot be too much division in England. That was his main purpose, to have division in England. But he didn't have to try for it because it came naturally. And the Tories and the Whigs were at each other's throats. In some cases, they hated each other more than they hated England's enemies. The Tories win the election of the summer of 1710. Queen Anne's already longing to get rid of the Marlboroughs, the Duchess even more than the Duke, as I'm sure you know from The Favourite. And the Tories, helped by public opinion and by the genius of Robert Harley, they begin a peace negotiation secretly behind the Allies' backs with Louis XIV. There you see Robert Harley dressed as in Pierre's robes. He's Lord High Treasurer of England, and please note France's fashion dominion. He's wearing a red heel, one of the fashions introduced by Louis XIV for courtiers of Versailles, which is rapidly imitated throughout Europe. And here is the Minister of War, St. John, later Viscount Bolingbroke, another Anglo-Frenchman. He's painted here by a French artist, Alexis Bell, while he's in Paris negotiating peace. And it was said of him that he seemed completely at ease in Versailles, Paris, because his French was so good. And Torcy, the foreign minister, says he's really like a French courtier. And Churchill, in his brilliant book, Marlborough, His Life and Times, which I recommend to all of you, nobody has understood the European politics of the time as well as Churchill. He wrote, "The Queen and the Lord Treasurer, aided and abetted by St. John, saved France as surely, although scarcely as nobly, as Joan of Arc." And they were terrified of the revenge of the future George I, the legal heir by Act of Parliament to the throne of England, for having betrayed him and the other English allies. So they begin to dabble with the Old Pretender and Jacobitism. And in fact, in 1715, Bolingbroke, this brilliant Tory, he would flee London, helped by the French ambassador, disguised as a French embassy servant, and he established himself in Paris, where he lived for much of the next 30 years and married a French woman. And here is the intermediary, a rather wonderful portrait now in Sizer Castle in Westmoreland, with other Jacobite portraits, again by Alexis Bell, of the Abbé Gautier, who is a French mole who'd been left behind in London at the beginning of the War of the Spanish Succession on the orders of his ambassador. He becomes chaplain in the Austrian embassy at a time when embassy chapels were the only legal places of worship for Catholics in England. And then he becomes a friend of Robert Harley, a drinking companion of Robert Harley. He speaks perfect English, and he begins to feed information to Versailles that the English government wants to make peace. And he's working for three people, for Harley, for Louis XIV, and for the Old Pretender. And he wrote that together France and England should, and I quote, "give the law to Europe." And so it goes on. That is Matthew Prior, who also by Alexis Bell, goes to make peace. Finally, 1713, that is the Duke of Ormond, more popular, who replaces Marlborough as Commander-in-Chief, in some ways more popular than Marlborough, a Tory general, but he also flees to France in 1715, terrified of George I's trying him for treason. And he lives in France for the next 30 years. That's the Old Pretender, the Young Pretender, a great French popular figure. And 1713, peace breaks out, and what happens? The English start pouring into Paris and Versailles again. And I just want to end with some of the remarks English travellers made about Versailles, which I hope show how much they admired the French court. "The most magnificent palace in Europe," writes Martin Lister. John Northley, "the most beautiful palace in Europe. The side which fronts the garden surpasses all that can be imagined sumptuous. A glorious prospect at a distance, far surpasses anything to be seen of this kind in Italy." Everard Valliard, this is about 1702, "masterpiece of art. In my opinion, the gardens far exceed those of Frascati and Tivoli." Later, Thomas Nugent called Versailles one of the finest in all Europe. The great marble staircase surpasses anything in antiquity. And proof of English love of Versailles are the incredible collections of French tapestries, furniture, and so on throughout England, Scotland, and Ireland, and the architectural imitations. Here is one facade of Chatsworth, partly based on Marly and the gardens with fountains, and in fact they have a water staircase as there was at Marly. This is Boughton, built by the Duke of Montague, who had been an ambassador to Louis XIV, who shelters Huguenots. There's a wonderful collection of Huguenot objects, and indeed, again, fountains and pièces d'or, partly modelled on Versailles, which Louis XIV had personally shown him round. Here you have the Painted Hall at Greenwich, one of England's answers to the Galerie des Glaces. It celebrates the Protestant succession, but is partly inspired by Versailles. Hampton Court, the wing added by Christopher Wren for William III after 1689, again partly inspired by rivalry with or desire to slightly imitate Versailles. And there is Versailles itself. And I want to end with a comment by Lord Chesterfield, the arbiter of taste in 18th century England, and he wrote in 1751 to his son, Philip Stanhope, "An hour at Versailles is worth 3 hours in a closet with the best books." So I think maybe we can agree that the Channel unites as well as divides. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Should Louis perhaps be blamed for instilling in French psyche the inclination towards grand projects, often at the expense of France's economy? I'm thinking in terms of Versailles,
Yes.
which robbed the country's national product hugely over several years.
But not as much as his wars.
But
And he thought it would help popularise French marble, French decorators, French furniture, French clothes that were on show. And now Versailles has 7 million visitors a year, more than anywhere except for the Forbidden City in Peking. So in a way, it's an investment that may have paid off in the long term. I mean, they don't know what to do with all their tourists. And it's used every evening, almost, for some event, show, product demonstration, or whatever.
oh, now?
No.
I mean, at the
And
time,
at the time, it was also demonstrating products.
and used more water than Paris.
It used a lot of water, and he deliberately sited it in a place without a water supply to prove he was greater than nature. Yes, it was no doubt not a logical use of resources. Yes.
I've always understood that the Duke of Marlborough and his nephew, the Duke of Berwick, kept corresponding with each other, even though they were generals on opposite sides. How did the 14th view that?
I think you're correct, they did correspond with each other. Probably Berwick, who was very loyal to his father and to France, told the authorities. The correspondence didn't really, I mean, Marlborough was playing with the Jacobites, saying, oh, at heart I'm really with you. But they knew he was lying, really. It's just a game, I think. Everybody's insuring themselves with the other side.
Well, generals of the 20th century couldn't have done that, could they? Even if they were elected.
Well, I think some German generals might have wanted to in the Second World War, I don't know. Yes.
Is there any record of the human cost of the construction of Versailles?
Well, there's no figures, but two or three letters in about 1668 say a lot of workmen are dying, falling off the scaffolding, and one mother of a dead workman screams at Louis XIV, "You're a monster," and she's of course severely punished and carted off to a lunatic asylum. I would have thought thousands died. Yes, and there's another military cost, and the soldiers were used for the waterworks in 1685 when there's no war on. And it's also unhealthy trying to make lakes and digging up marshland, that many of them die or fall ill and then infect other soldiers when they're re-stationed somewhere else. But foreigners quite liked news of buildings at Versailles because they thought it meant there was going to be no war. Yes.
I've always assumed that the departure of the Huguenots, who were, as you know, brilliant craftsmen, brilliant at everything they did, caused some sort of economic depression in France. Would that be correct?
Well, people discuss this, people dispute this. I'm sure it did. but less than the wars themselves, which of course the Huguenots partly provoked by stirring England and Brandenburg and Holland. They were replaced by quite a lot of Catholic immigrants, not just Jacobites, but Catholic Germans. It's very hard to measure. I'm sure it helped weaken the French economy. And there is an apocryphal remark of de Gaulle: if Louis XIV had not revoked the Edict of Nantes, maybe the first man on the moon would have spoken French. Any more questions? No. Well, the book is on sale.